Hey guys, welcome back to Diving Deep in Thought. You hear the lies. Today I want to talk to you guys about suffering. I'm sure you've suffered in your life. If you haven't, that's really, really good. That means that you haven't either challenged yourself or you haven't grown, because growth is pain, and pain creates suffering. Suffering creates change. Change creates development. So there's a process. So everyone's suffered, and we all suffer at different intensities depending on how badly it affects our identity or affects who we are. So our suffering is dependent on our identity. So if someone says to you, who's been training all your life, you're very, very fit, very healthy, and someone comes up to you and says, you're very fat, you can't run a marathon, you're going to be very offended by this statement. Now, this statement will offend you because it doesn't agree with who you think you are. Now, that same statement could be given to someone else and they'll shrug it off. So suffering is somewhat dependent on our perspective of who we are. And it's a way of growth. So let's break down an example of suffering. So if you have Mr. Olympia, the bodybuilding competitions, at the top, you've won Mr. Olympia. Now let's break it down and go backwards. He won that because he was disciplined. He persevered. He overcame his demons. Then we step back from that and it comes down to suffering every day in the gym, eating well where other people are eating crap. Then one step down is pain. You underwent a lot of pain, physical pain, mental pain, emotional pain, going through that procedure. You got to remember, you're so dedicated to your art that you're not with your friends and family. You're dedicated, you're on a mission. And then before that is your old self. So your old self, the difference between your old self and your new self. So your old self could be a regular person and your new self could be Mr. Olympia, this world's best bodybuilder. The difference between your old self and your new self is how many hoops of fire you're willing to jump through to be the person on the other end. So if your challenges are these hoops of fire, you've got to jump through so many of them to get to the other end, to be this strengthened, more powerful, more determined, more confident. So there's no way around the hoops of fire. These hoops of fire are leaps of faith. They're stretching you out a little bit. Now, these hoops of fire can be very closely spaced, which makes things very impossible, so you can do too much at once. Or they can be really fast spaced, and they're not really going to challenge you. So these hoops of fire are what you have to jump through to connect the old self to the new self. And the new self, in order to get to the new self, there has to be an element of pain. If there's not an element of pain, there's not an element of growth. So when you were growing up and your knees were hurting, when you were going through puberty, the explanation for that is that you're growing. So it's a pain that you accepted. You've accepted that pain, but that pain is not still with you, is it? Because you've accepted that there was an outcome because of it. So the reason a lot of people, mentally, physically, whatever, suffer so much is that there was the seed of that pain was something that doesn't align with who they truly are, so their future self. And they can't get there unless they address that problem. So it's like if your light in your house blows up, you don't go shut the window to fix it. It's the light's blown, so you go and change the bulb. And it's the same thing with our suffering. If we don't backtrack it to where the cause of it is, all we're doing is doing other things to relieve that or to cover that suffering. But actually, it's always going to be there. And when you address it and you come to when you close that chapter of suffering, or you come to terms with acceptance, it existed, I learned this from it, I grew this much from it. What happens is that suffering does not become pain anymore, but it becomes the fuel for the new identity. And what happens is, every time you overcome and defeat one monster, you start to create bigger ones. And that's the process of growth. That's the process of success. There's so many failures that you have to go through, the hoops of fire that you got to jump through to be the person on the other end of that hoop. Now, you might find ways of getting around that hoop. Maybe one of them, second one, but then you're going to be faced with the next one. It's inevitable. We gradually increase our difficulty. So if you haven't jumped through the first two, the third one's going to be very hard. So you can't really shortcut this experience. You have to suffer. You don't have to suffer and make it painful and make it agony for the sake of that, because suffering that doesn't have a meaning stays suffering, but suffering that has a meaning becomes sacrifice. So when you sacrifice and you grow, what that's telling your body is that you've overcome this challenge. It's like a mental receipt to what you've actually accomplished. So you're not, God's not going to send his toughest soldiers to do the most difficult tasks. We do the most difficult tasks to become the toughest soldiers. So the merit is in the work you do and your ability to overcome and progressively increase these challenges. And what comes with that is self-confidence. So you get a lot of people who are trying to shortcut this process. But what they're actually doing is they're becoming the new identity without the receipt. So it's almost like thieving the mindset. Now you'll have it in your brain, but your body doesn't remember it. So if you get into a job you're not ready for physically, your body's going to suffer. And it's going to suffer too much. It's not progressive. So that's going to hurt. And that's not going to prepare you for the next step. So what you've done is you've walked around these hoops and you finally got to one you can't go through. So it's very important that not only you endure that suffering, but you understand why. Why is it happening? Because undirected suffering is torture. So it's very important to know what you are working for, what you are working toward. Time's always going to be happening anyway. That's something you can't control. But what you can control is the attention and the intention that you have in the time throughout the day. And if you keep getting these recurring thoughts of physical pain or mental pain or regret or doubt, they're guiding you to a certain direction. And if they're not guiding you, then why are you feeling them? They must be guiding you. So if you find that, for example, you can't commit to your work mentally, then you have to start acting on certain skills to prepare you for that job. And the easiest way to always find out what you've got to do is to backtrack your work. There's no point looking for an answer to a solution you haven't defined yet, to a problem you haven't defined yet. So if you haven't defined your problem, your solution is trial and error, and it will make you feel good in the moment, but you're not actually addressing the deep-rooted pain that grows into suffering, that'll grow into resentment. And if you don't close that chapter and accept the fact that that happened, and you can use that as leverage to move forward, then it'll continuously keep coming at you. So you actually do have to endure that experience, but for a certain period of time only, in order to close that chapter up so that it doesn't keep recurring. Strength doesn't come with your ability to forget suffering. Strength comes with your ability to face it, accept it, come to terms with it, and understand that it was a previous version of yourself that went through that. It doesn't apply to now. As hard as this may feel right now, it doesn't actually apply to this exact moment. It's in your registry, and you can attach a different feeling to that if you want to. And it doesn't mean you're not deceiving yourself, you're not making the moment any less than what it is, but you're basically reducing the emotional quotient you tied to that in a previous time in your life. Like, remember I told you about the pain when you were undergoing puberty or whatever, your growth? That's not still with you. You've acknowledged it happened and you bypassed it. The receipt is you grew. That's the truth. You grew. And it's the same thing. So you're not forgetting. You're coming, you're facing them. Face these previous hoops of fire that you've walked around and just accept them for what they are. Understand that it was a previous version of you that experienced it. Come to terms with what you got out of it or how you perceive it. Did you perceive it? You know, if something happened to you when you were 12 years old and it stuck to you and say you're 27 now, so it's 15 years ago, do you look at that event from a 12-year-old person or a 27-year-old person that a 12-year-old experienced? You acknowledge that, you've accepted that, you understood it impacted you there, and you drag this baggage with you to affect you today. So this is something to consider. So suffering is absolutely essential for growth. Without pain, there is no suffering. Everything we undergo, you know, even our muscles on a micro level are undergoing some form of suffering due to gravity, and that enables them to grow so they don't atrophy. Our brains, same thing. Everything is getting replenished and going through a process of growth. And the distance between your old self and your new self is those hoops of fire. So keep jumping through those hoops of fire. Acknowledge that they're there. Acknowledge that it is a part of you. Don't deny that part of you, because that part of you is the strength. And your strength is only measured by the challenges you've overcome. Your strength is not how how well you can block things off. It's how well you can face things, accept them, and move forward positively. Thanks for listening, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share.